What's up everybody, welcome back to the channel. So I find myself in this unusual situation where for once I'm actually allowed to use some of the work I did for a client. I just thought it would be great to share it with you. I think it would be, a good learning opportunity for everybody, really. It was a fun gig. It was a bit of an unusual gig. I'm not normally doing stuff like this. I'm gonna put the link to Adam's work, Adam's YouTube in the description if you want to check it out. He says he doesn't have much content yet, but he may be posting in the future. So what was the work? It was quite simple, really, quite a simple job. The composer wasn't really happy about the arrangement of his own composition, and he basically wanted me to revamp it a little bit. And yet once again, I'm not normally allowed this degree of freedom, but I believe this project wasn't done to picture, and that's why basically I was allowed to do what I did. Obviously that doesn't mean that we can't completely discard of everything the composer already did. That would be quite dumb. But how are we going to do that? How are we going to revamp the original without changing the essence of it? Do a different arrangement based on the original. There are a few ways. My approach to this was basically trying and find some of the more problematic areas of the original. Not that the original arrangement has problems, but of course it can be improved. Otherwise the client wouldn't have reached out in the first place. Try and find those areas and basically once we have a concept, build our arrangement around it. So I basically ended up listening to the original quite a few times just to get a vibe, yeah. And I found a few things that I wanted to improve. First of all, as you'll hear, the original version is quite dark, and that was due to some of the voicings and some of the lead parts as well being focused in a mid to low register most of the time, yeah. Second thing I wanted to improve was, give the arrangement more momentum, yeah. It felt at times that the original could use some more moving textures to make it less static and give it more interest, hopefully. And last but not least, give it a little bit more clarity and focus, which is, as you know, if you have been watching my videos, that's always one of my goals. So let's jump into the project and start comparing some stuff. So let's pretend for a second I didn't do all this work ahead of time yet. I didn't already finish this project. Once again, I just listen to the piece a few times and find some of the key areas I want to improve, and then just zero in specific sections, right? And listen to the details and see how I could practically, work on those. So let's have a listen to the original version, just introduction, just the first few bars, and see how we could improve those. Alright, not bad. So that's the original. Let me now play my version. So you can see that it's not substantially different from the original, right? I did try to keep the essence of it as the composer wished, but there are a few changes. If we open the MIDI for the original version, you can see already that it suffers a little bit from some of the things that I mentioned before, right? First of all, clarity. We have a little bit of clutter, right? That could be easily cleaned up. Vague chords over here at the beginning. And second of all, we have the melody in the same register as the harmony for the second half of the part, which is not necessarily always an issue, but whenever you do that, you may want to make sure to, counterbalance that by doubling the melody with somebody else, you know, to give it a little bit more strength. If we open my MIDI, you can see that I'm basically trying to address some of these issues. This is the beginning, you know, with the melody basically just right below the string registers, and also in terms of voicing, some kind of cleaning up, right? And as the melody repeats, you know, I'm both doubling it with the cello, but I'm also giving space to the melody for it to breathe, you know? And this is a tried and true method. Yeah, I can assure you it works 100% of the time. So here's just the strings. Right, some nice counterpoint at the end. Also, something I want to point your attention to is how this section leads into the next one. So let me go back to the original 1 second, and then we'll listen to my version. The melody goes from French horn to English horn or oboe. What I ended up doing is basically using the same instruments for the lead, right? We want to keep the essence of the original, but I introduced the English horn just a few bars early, right? To make the transition in between the two sections a little bit smoother. So let's have a listen to my version. Right, so very smooth transition. We barely even need percussion here. You know, it's very, I think I may be using some cymbals, but it's very light. We could be rid of them entirely and it wouldn't make any difference whatsoever. What else do we have in this section? Let's focus on the strings. So why did I do something like that while the original only really has some pads really underneath the solo instrument over the top? Well, this is just to make it a little bit more interesting. Once again, just to give it a little bit more forward momentum. Like we discussed at the beginning, that was one of my goals with this arrangement. But let's go into something a little bit more interesting. Let's move into the next section. Listening to this section tells me that the composer wants something a little bit more bombastic. This is not yet the climax of the piece, but he wants to take it up a notch, right? And if we look at the MIDI, you can tell that he's using some textures, right? Some faster repeated notes on the winds, and we have the melody in octaves being played by strings, and the French horn comes back in later on. So that tells me that the composer wants something a little bit more bombastic, right? So let's have a listen to my version and I'll tell you what I ended up doing and why. So there's quite a few things going on, but it's actually simpler than it sounds. You can see that in the strings, I basically still have the same kind of textures that I showed you before, but I added one more voice, you know. Before it was just violas and now it's cellos and violas together. This is the foundation of the arrangement. It doesn't really need anything else. It already sounds pretty good on its own. But once again, if we want to take it up a notch, we need to add more stuff. And this is where I've looked at the original and taken inspiration from it. You know, if we look at the winds, for example, you see you'll see that I basically have the same short repeated notes that we have in the original. We have a doubling, overlapping in the same register, but it's not a massive issue here because the oboe is just doubling the strings, right, that are already playing in octaves. And in the low register, we just have some brass. Glue all these parts down with some sustains to basically make the harmony a little bit clearer. But also we did have that in the original as well. So if I mute a melody, even without the melody, all the background textures have a lot of life. So that's it really. This continues for a bit. The only difference for the second half of the section, I basically have the strings playing in harmony, right? Just to make it a little bit more romantic, a little bit more heroic, right? But that's basically the essence of this section, right? Let's move on to something else. We basically have three sections that get the melody passed to different instruments, starting with French horns, that goes to oboes or English horn, and then finally goes back to strings again. And you'll see that my version basically uses the same idea, right? I'm using pretty much similar instruments for the lead. As you can see from the MIDI, we have some overlapping parts. So oftentimes, whenever we do that, it's a good idea to double, right? Just to maintain clarity. This is not something that we had in the original, and I believe I may have changed the octave as well, just to make it a little bit brighter. But also, if we go back to the original for just 1 second, tell it's quite dark because most of the accompaniment is focused on the low end, and this is obviously something that I try to address by shifting the accompaniment to a different register. So I'm just gonna mute violas and French horns for now, just so you can hear just the accompaniment. Oh, I think I had bassoons as well. Let me mute those. You see, the whole idea behind it is using doublings to make the melody pop out. And on the last two bars, you see that I used a similar trick that you saw me using before, using a different instrument to pick up the lead and transition into the following section. I do it all the time. It's kind of one of my trademarks. Not that it's innovative by any means, but it just works. So very simple idea. Let's have a listen to the following 4 bars. So, yeah, it's quite uninteresting, really. I'm basically following the original closely, at least in terms of who's taking the lead, and I'm continuing the background texture that you hear, you know, all the movement within the string section, really, just to give it more momentum and make it a little bit more interesting. What happens after this? Right, so that was the original. It's a brass moment, and you see that I'm probably doing something similar, but using a different register to kind of make it a little bit brighter and a little bit less muddy. right? Some octave doublings to give focus to the melody once again, but also kind of opening up those voicings to make them a little bit brighter and less muddy. Let's carry on to the following section, that is the climax of the piece. Let's have a listen to the original first. Right, so lots of cool ideas here. I hope you agree. And you see that my version takes inspiration from the original, but I also try to take it up a notch. This is the climax of the piece, and this is the moment where we can basically give up all the instruments and give a very soaring version of the melody for a final time. So lots of overlapping registers here, but this is not really a problem for this section because we have very strong trumpets and French horns playing the melody in octaves, right? And what I ended up reusing, as you see, from the original is basically the driving motor that we have in the background with spiccato strings and winds. I simply used a different articulation. Why? You know, the legato articulation that we had in the original wasn't, I felt like was fighting with a very heavy brass and wasn't really quite cutting through. Simply by changing articulation to something that has a little bit more bite, is a little bit more aggressive, you know, it's much easier to make the parts stand out. Obviously using, you know, higher registers as well kind of helps it even further. So let's just mute once again the melody so that you can hear the background textures, because this is the main difference between my version and And what you see over there is basically just some accents, really, with percussion and the rest of the strings and some woodwind runs as well to echo the melody. So the second half of the chorus continues with similar ideas. And regarding brass, I'm basically harmonizing, you know, trumpets and French horns. So that's it, really. I think the ending of the piece is probably the same as the original. Yep, it is the same. Yep, it's the same. We can play it later. So simple stuff. Yeah, I hope you agree. But this just works 100% of the times. Yeah, I can guarantee it. You know, if you have something that is maybe 80% of the way, it's just a simple matter of having, you know, some critical thinking and trying to individuate some of the key areas like we did here. You know, for this specific case, it was giving the composition a little bit of momentum, a little bit of clarity, and making it a little bit brighter, and then just narrowing in specific sections and find the actual parts that need reworking, but with your previous considerations in mind. Okay, I hope this was useful. It was a pretty fun project. Thank you very much, Adam, once again for allowing me to share all this with everybody. So let's have a listen to the full piece.